Okay. This is a fabulous event. It's a holiday lecture. We expect a little better than that. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Thank you. I'm Alan Leshner. I'm sort of in a weird position. I'm the current interim CEO of AAAS. I had been the CEO for a while, 13 years. Then I happily retired, and then I came back to fill in. So I'm what's known as a fill-in. But I will go back to happy retirement in a couple of weeks. And I get the great pleasure of greeting you and welcoming you to our house. This is a wonderful event. It is, in fact, the 10th anniversary of these holiday lectures, and I'm told the 25th anniversary coming up of the DOSER program. I chose to come and insert myself, even though I'm not on the program, because I love this program. The DOSER program is truly unique in the world. There is nothing like it that actually does this kind of bringing together of people from the scientific community, from a variety of faith communities, and they talk to each other, which is something really delightful and relatively rare. I will say that with Jennifer's leadership, it has become a large and highly effective, she and her colleagues, who are arrayed here, have done a spectacular job building unique programs that bring together faith and scientific communities in conversation, doing such interesting things as helping theological schools develop curricula for their students so they understand the nature of science, its limits, its possibilities, and things like that. Think about that. How many scientific organizations actually do it? So since I'm no longer in charge, I can brag. We are really good. Anyway, it's a wonderful event. We have a wonderful speaker. I'm going to give you Jennifer Wiseman, the director of the program, who will introduce it, and I'll repeat, welcome. And happy holidays.
So good evening and happy holidays. This has become kind of a tradition here at AAAS, and a festive one, even though sometimes the topics are challenging. But I'm glad you're here, and also to those of you who are watching the live stream, or eventually the recording, or those of you in the overflow room, we are delighted that you're joining us as well. I want to tell you a little bit about our program here at the AAAS, and then we'll talk about tonight's event, which, as you see before you, is entitled A Climate of Hope, Scientists and Faith Communities Addressing the Climate Crisis. The Dialogue on Science, Ethics, and Religion, or DOSER program, was established by AAAS in 1995 to facilitate communication between scientific and religious communities. It was recognized that most people in this country, and in fact around the world, identify with some kind of a faith tradition or culture, and often view science and its impacts and importance through the lens of that affiliation or that identity. And so scientists would do well to develop good dialogue with faith communities. And of course, these are overlapping communities as well. DOSER builds on AAAS's commitment to relate scientific knowledge and technological development to the purposes and concerns and interests of society at large. And there's some action photos you'll see of some of the many events that DOSER has sponsored over the years. You can find out more at our website there, AAAS.org/DOSER. Here's some examples of some of the public lectures and the meeting symposia that we've sponsored. And I just pointing out that often what we do is take a hot topic in science or technology and then bring into the conversation scientists, ethicists, and leaders of faith communities to talk about why this development in science and technology is interesting and pertinent, and what are the implications, perhaps ethical challenges or perhaps promising blessings for society that can come from these advances in science and technology. So first of all, just coming up, I want you to be aware that at the 2020 AAAS annual meeting, this time it will be in Seattle, Washington, we will have several Dozer-sponsored activities there, including a couple of interesting symposia, one responding to climate change, science, religion, and cultural practices, and another one, Death in the 21st Century, What is Left Behind? And you'll have to read about that to find out what we mean by that, but very interesting issues there. Some other examples you can see there that we've highlighted, resilience and the biology of it, how science and faith communities can work together in terms of resilience after even natural disasters, gene editing and human identity, promising advances and ethical challenges, still a very hot topic. The tapestry of health, how genetic diversity, history, and cultural identity intertwine. Of minds and machines, what artificial intelligence tells us about ourselves. Cooperation and creativity in human evolution. Did my brain make me do it? The neuroscience of morality. That was a very interesting holiday lecture we had. And many more. And you can see the recordings of all of these at our Dozer website. What are we doing now? Well, in addition to having these events and symposia, we also have some longer-term projects where we can really, hopefully, make a difference in a meaningful way for a lot of people. So one of them, those projects, is called Engaging Scientists in the Science and Religion Dialogue. We have many scientists, AAAS members, who come to us and say, we like your program, we'd like to get involved. How can we get involved? Or, you know, I interface with a lot of students from different faith traditions in my classroom or in my public audiences, and I don't know exactly how best to talk about science with these communities without unnecessarily alienating them, to make sure they feel welcome in these discussions. And so we've been holding workshops for scientists at scientific society meetings and at research universities where we are invited to come and help scientists learn more about people of faith in their own midst there. These are going over very well, and there's a booklet that you might find useful in your own realm of life called Scientists in Civic Life, Facilitating Dialogue-Based Communication, and that's also available on our website. Another project area that Dr. Leshner mentioned is science and theological education. We are working with dozens of seminaries across the country and beyond who are trying to bring more relevant science into the training of future clergy. And those clergy have a lot of influence on people across the country and around the world. And this is a very, very active program, going very well. I think one of the products of this is a film series that is actually useful beyond seminary classrooms. It's called Science, the Wide Angle. And these are little 3-minute films on every hot topic in science you can think of, with scientists talking about why their science is interesting and has broader implications. They're good discussion starters in any setting. So I encourage you to look up the Science, the Wide Angle film series. Right now it's on our Science for Seminaries website, but it'll soon be accessible. We have a YouTube channel as well. All right, so you can stay connected through all of these portals, our websites. We also have an active newsletter. You can sign up for that outside on the table there. It's only quarterly. We're active on social media. So please do stay connected. And I also want to mention that this coming year is Dozer's 25th anniversary, so we plan to have some special events. So if you sign up on the newsletter, you'll learn about them as they get put together. Also, AAAS is a nonprofit organization, so if you would like to support the work of Dozer to help make more events like this happen, we would greatly appreciate it, and you can donate directly to our program using the link that's on the back of your program here. All right, so welcome. I'd like now to talk about our program tonight. We decided to bring to focus what is often seen as a problematic relationship, and that is the discussion of climate change and the role of faith communities. But we believe this is actually a discussion that can create much good hope for the future. So the topic of tonight's special event is A Climate of Hope, Scientists and Faith Communities Addressing the Climate Crisis. Before we get started with introductions here, we would like to gratefully acknowledge the Native peoples on whose ancestral homelands we are gathering right now, as well as the diverse and vibrant Native communities who make their home here today. Worldwide, accumulated data show that the climate is changing at an unprecedented rate and that this crisis is primarily a result of human activity. The changes have resulted in warming oceans, extreme weather events, shrinking ice sheets, sea level rise, and more. Delicate ecosystems and the poorest and most vulnerable people in societies are disproportionately affected by this devastation. Many religious communities are working closely with scientists, civic leaders, and policymakers to address the causes and effects of climate change. However, although there is overlap between the groups, sometimes scientists and people of faith experience challenges understanding and engaging each other. Dr. Katharine Hayhoe and Bishop Katharine Jefferts Schori, as scientists and leaders in their faith communities, help build trust and enhance communication between the scientific and religious communities. They connect forefront science with a passion for world service in ways that resonate with both groups, fostering dialogue about shaping effective practices for environmental stewardship. Tonight's lecture is a discussion about climate change, environmental stewardship, and the ways that faith communities and scientists are working together to address one of today's most pressing issues. I am so delighted that we have these speakers tonight. Our keynote lecturer is Dr. Katharine Hayhoe, climate scientist and the director of Texas Tech University's Climate Science Center. Our discussant is the Right Reverend Bishop Dr. Katharine Jefferts Schori, the 26th presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church. I'll say more about her when she comes to speak. Katharine Hayhoe is an atmospheric scientist whose research focuses on developing and applying high-resolution climate projections to understand what climate change means for people in the natural environment. She's a professor and the director of the Climate Science Center at Texas Tech University and has a BS in physics from the University of Toronto and an MS and PhD in atmospheric science from the University of Illinois. Dr. Hayhoe has served as a lead author for the second and third U.S. National Climate Assessments and has conducted climate impact assessments for a broad cross-section of organizations, cities, and regions, from Boston Logan Airport to the state of California. She chairs the Earth Science Women's Network Advisory Council and also serves on the Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History's Anthropocene Advisory Council, the American Geophysical Union's Climate Communications Prize Committee, and the advisory board for the AAAS How We Respond project. And by the way, Dr. Hayhoe was a keynote lecturer at the AAAS annual meeting last year, where she gave a talk entitled "Facts Are Not Enough." Very well received. She's received numerous awards, including the 2019 United Nations Champions of the Earth Award and the 2018 Stephen H. Schneider Award for Outstanding Climate Science Communication, and has been named one of the Foreign Policy's 100 Leading Global Thinkers twice, one of the Fortune World's Great Leaders 2017, and one of Time Magazine's 100 Most Influential People. She's also really nice, and the reason people like Katharine Hayhoe also is that she is a very warm person. She interacts on a very personal level with fellow scientists and with people in faith communities, of which she is also a part. And this has made all the difference. So, Dr. Katharine Hayhoe, we welcome you to the podium, and we look forward to hearing what you have to share with us this evening.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. And true to my reputation, we will be interacting tonight. So even if you are online, you will still be able to participate. I'm going to switch over here. Yep, and then just hold that. Yep, there we go. Just give the technology a minute to catch up with us. Here we go, yes. So if you have a smartphone with you, or even if you have a laptop, please go ahead and take it out. I know that's an unusual thing to say. Turn the ringer off while you're doing so. And what I want you to do is I want you to go to pollev.com. That's POLLEV.com. It will ask you to enter something, and what you want to enter is Texas Tech, all one word. That's the name of my university. You are not committing to support us in basketball or anything like that. And if it asks your name, don't worry about that. You don't have to answer a name. So pollev.com. You can do this online or you can do this in person. And when you go there, the first question will pop up. The first question is an easy question. It is simply, who are you? What do you work in? So it looks like we've got, oh, okay, so the nonprofits or faith-based are off to an early lead, but the government is catching up. Sort of feel like election night, doesn't it? The private sector is lagging slowly behind. I don't know, fellow academics, you gotta get your fingers going. We're a bit slow here. Okay. The nonprofit and faith sector is still holding the lead, but that lead is narrowing, and now the government and academia are neck and neck. And again, this is people who are listening online, not just here. So I don't know, this is too tight to call. We know who's in first place, but who's going to be second? Isn't this cool? It's updating actually as you go. Oh, I don't know. All right, I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to go ahead and call it. The turtle won the race. Academia and education was a little slow to catch up, but when they did take over second place. We've got government in third and private sector, and I am done with all that at last. So over the last few years, the number one question that I have received is this: what gives you hope? And now I get this question on an almost weekly basis, and so I think about it a lot. And what I want to do is I want to start by talking about what does not give me hope. The first thing on the list of what does not give me hope is the science that I do. I was one of the lead authors on the National Climate Assessment that was released a year ago last Thanksgiving, the so-called Black Friday Report. In this report, which I served as lead author on both Volume 1 on the science and Volume 2 on the impacts, we find such cheerful conclusions as average temperatures have never been higher or have risen faster than any time in the past 1,700 years or more. And even worse, in the last chapter, which I served as lead author on too, future changes outside the range projected by climate models cannot be ruled out. Moreover, the systematic tendency of our models to underestimate temperature change during warm paleoclimates in the past suggests that we are more likely to rather than overestimate the amount of long-term change. If that is not depressing, I don't know what is. When I look at the science that other people are doing, I don't see a lot of hope there either. You just kind of review some of the headlines from this past year. The glaciers are melting faster. Sea level is rising faster. It could cost hundreds of billions of dollars a year. A new report finds the costs are underestimated. We have been underestimating the pace of change. I don't only study the science, I also study the impacts. I study what climate change means to us in the places where we live. And when we look at the impacts, the image is similarly dire. The worst wildfire season on record in Alaska. Climate change made the European heat wave 5 times more likely. Alaska's sea ice completely melted for the first time in recorded history. Fires in Canada and California. Floods in Bangladesh, Indonesia, and Nebraska. As the Prime Minister of Dominica said, which was one of the islands that was devastated in the 2017 hurricane season, he said, "To deny climate change is to deny a truth that we have lived." In May, 2 colleagues at Stanford published a study showing that climate change has already increased the gap between the richest and poorest countries in the world by as much as 25% already. So I don't find hope in the science that we do. How about politics? No, not a lot of hope there. And you might say, oh, but that's just in the United States. Well, I'm sorry to say it isn't. If you live in the UK, Conservative members of Parliament are 5 times as likely to vote against climate action than members of the Labour Party. We just had a recent election in Canada. As you may know, in Canadian politics, we have quite a few parties. One of our party's position, the People's Party of Canada, was that climate change does not exist. The Conservative plan was it does exist, and here's our plan to fix it, and actually our plan will increase carbon emissions. And then you can talk about what happens in Australia, what happens in Brazil. There's not a lot of hope in politics either. And then for a little light relief, I go to social media. And I didn't pick these specially, I just opened up my file. I keep a file for scientific research purposes. I keep a file, and these were just 3 of the ones near the top of the file. So, what gives you hope? There are things that give me hope, and there are things that give all of us hope, but I'm going to ask you first before we go there. Get your phone back out again. I want to ask you what gives you hope, but this time the question's a little bit harder. You don't pick A, B, or C. You have to give me a word. And here's the tricky part. If it's more than one word, you have to use a dot or a dash to join the words. So if you are going to answer, for example, the world, you want to answer the dot world, okay? So one word, or, there we go, the person who had my students got the picture. A dot in between. All right, what gives you hope? So we've got people, youth activists, people that we know, people that we hear about in the news. Oh, doser, I like that. That's good. Bacteria, I have to say that that's a new one. That is a new one. I have not seen that one before. But what is the commonality that we see here? What is the common denominator here? It's mostly people. So being a scientist, I have asked this question in a few different places. And I have added up more than 500 responses that I've received from asking this question in the United States, Canada, and the UK. And here are the most popular responses. The number 1 response is youth and children, whether specific or general. Then we have adult leaders, advocates, technology and innovation, changing attitudes in education, faith, God, spirituality, movements, organizations, people collaborating and talking. We have science down there at number, what is that? 9. Political parties, wow, that actually made the list. I guess there is some hope somewhere. Love, compassion, and creativity, family, friends, community, and a few people answered nothing. So I want to unpack these because we need hope. Without hope, we are going to be a self-fulfilling prophecy of despair. If we do not have a better vision to head towards, the apocalypse is not enough to keep us running for as long as we need to fix climate change. So let's first of all look at what gives you hope when you look to children and young people. Well, one thing that gives me hope is the fact that there's a lot of really smart young people around, and they're doing amazing things. Did you know that at the AGU meeting, which some of you may have been at, it's the meeting of almost 30,000 geoscientists from around the world every year, there was an 11-year-old girl presenting there for the 2nd time because of her research on renewable energy. Another girl built an algae biofuel lab, originally I think in her bedroom, but it had to be moved up to the garage. And she won the Intel Science Fair. When you look at how students are being activists, they are doing incredible things. Almost every time we see climate change mentioned in the news now, it talks about children. There's children suing the federal government for a right to their future. And when you say children, there's probably two images that pop into your head the most. The first image is this happy girl who finally made it home this week after a very long trip around North America, and that's Greta Thunberg. But then the other image that probably pops into your head is who? Somebody you know, your child, your grandchild, my son. Why do young people give us hope? Not because we depend on them to fix it, because that's why we're fighting, isn't it? Have you ever seen a movie called Children of Men? It's a movie about what happens if people can't have children anymore. And it is the most hopeless world that you have ever seen, because children are our hope. So there absolutely is a reason why that is number one on the list. What about, I'm going to group these two categories together, what about adult leaders, advocates, movements, and organization? What gives me hope there? Because I absolutely get hope from there too. I get hope from unexpected actors, Republicans speaking up for carbon policy and carbon pricing, libertarians talking about climate change. The fact that even though the United States plans to pull out of the Paris Agreement, nearly 50% of the country is still in through the We Are Still In movement. That gives me hope. I get hope from bipartisan organizations like Citizens Climate Lobby that kindly and patiently work with people across the whole political spectrum. I get hope from some of my favorite faith-based organizations, like Young Evangelicals for Climate Action or AAAS, the International Conservation Organization. The last few years, I've gotten hope even from seeing what countries are doing. Countries divesting from fossil fuels, phasing out coal. The Yale program on climate connections asked a few of us scientists this year, what were your high and your low points? And I didn't realize I was a bit of an overachiever because when they published the article, nobody else had a bulleted list except me. Everybody else had one or two things, and I was like, well, here's my list. And they published the whole thing. They didn't have to do that. And my list, I made a list of countries, of the fact of what Canada's doing, that they have a price on carbon. The UK has at least temporarily banned fracking. Finland's phasing out coal. Norway's Sovereign Wealth Fund is divesting from companies that are exploring for oil and gas. Ireland became the first country to divest from fossil fuels, and New Zealand has committed to being carbon neutral by 2050. Scotland is going to beat them, hopefully, 2045. I get hope from corporations. Did you know that Walmart is the richest company in the world, but it's planning to be 50% clean energy by 2025? And Apple's about number 12. It's already 100% clean energy, and it's decarbonizing its supply chain in China. Wealth funds are starting to divest. And I love this quote because it comes from the Rockefeller Fund. How did Rockefeller make his money? By switching from whale oil to oil. And so they said, we are quite convinced that if John Dee were alive today as an astute businessman looking to the future, he would be moving out of fossil fuels and investing in clean renewable energy, so that is why we are doing it. Isn't that hopeful? I hope you're feeling better already, because these are some pretty hopeful things. I'm not done. There's the fact that in the energy sector, 2014, 5 years ago, was when fossil fuels lost the race against clean energy. What am I talking about? That was the first year where more than 50% of new energy being installed around the world, new energy, was not fossil fuels. We're up to 70% now. Isn't that amazing? And it's happening in unexpected places and ways, like Texas and India and China. But it's also happening in places where people don't have energy today and they need it. And these are some of the most hopeful stories. What else? We've talked about children, we've talked about organizations and advocates. What about technology and innovation? That definitely gives us hope. In fact, I track my Facebook posts, and the posts that get the most likes are the ones about new technological innovations. I mean, just look at the lineup when there's a new iPhone that comes out. We love technology, and technology is a tool. It can be used for good or evil, but in this case, it can certainly be used for good, and churches are doing that. Imagine the building permits that you have to get to put solar panels on an 1,100-year-old cathedral. Well, they did it in Gloucester, and they're very proud of it. The other image is from St. Matthew's in Minnesota. They decided they would put a cross on while they were at it. I'm proud to serve as the climate ambassador for the World Evangelical Alliance that is going to be taking 1 out of every 5 of its facilities and powering it with solar power. That's pretty cool. And some organizations are taking their roofs or their land, and I love this picture because this is from the Monastery of Our Lady of Mount Carmel in Washington, D.C. They're taking their land and creating a community solar garden. So you can buy into a larger array, which is more affordable than putting them on your own roof. That's pretty cool. Universities are getting in on the action. Did you know that Ball State University, famous for David Letterman, Ball State is powered entirely by geothermal energy. They have over 30,000 wells they dug around the whole campus. Scotland is testing tidal energy. They've got modular reactors that actually don't produce nuclear waste. That's pretty stunning. And there's companies like this BC company that can suck carbon out of the air and turn it into fuel. Innovation is fascinating, and it isn't all super high tech. Project Drawdown, which hopefully you're familiar with. If you're not, look it up. Project Drawdown lists 100 solutions to climate change, and some of them are very low tech, like reducing our food waste, regenerative agriculture, biochar, where you burn agricultural waste at high temperature and plow it back into the soil, and clean cook stoves. These are all technologies that improve our lives. Then there's the idea of changing our attitudes and education. And we have absolutely seen our attitudes changing. In some cases, they change because of messages that tell us just how bad it is. This article came out 1.5 years ago and was followed by a book by David Wallace Wells called The Uninhabitable Earth. And it showed just how bad it could be. Now, these types of messages showing us how bad it could be, they get a lot of media hits. All of the bad news with the wildfires and the floods and the glaciers melting and the IPCC reports and the National Climate Assessment, all of this news has contributed to a significant increase in media coverage of climate change. This map is from the University of Chicago. Max Boykoff there tracks media articles, and you can see that from 2018 to 2020, there has been a significant increase, a large uptake in media coverage. The Yale Program on Climate Communication, which tracks public opinion on climate change, they found the biggest jump they had ever measured in levels of concern over climate change this past year. The biggest ever. And when they asked me, I said, well, I think a big part of that is we're starting to see it with our own eyes in the places where we live. But by themselves, fear-based messages are not enough. Because when we hear things that are scary, but we don't think we can do anything about it, we just want to do what? We just want to pull the covers over our head and go back to sleep. Or if we feel like there's nothing we can do, we have to dissociate from it because we can't carry that burden of anxiety and fear if we feel like we can't respond. So public awareness is a little bit of a mixed bag, because if we're aware of how bad it is, but we don't have the hope that we can fix it, that's not going to help us and lead us to long-term solutions. But the last one on this list that I want to talk about is the one that is nearest and dearest to my heart, and it's the topic of tonight. It's the idea that our faith or God or our spirituality gives us hope. Now, you might say, that's fine for you, Katharine. We know that the intersection between people who are research scientists and people who identify with a specific faith is about as big as this. We have Jennifer Wiseman. We have Bishop Katharine. She's an oceanographer. We've got me, and oh yes, we also have Francis Collins. Well, thanks to Doser, we know that that isn't true. There's a fascinating project called Perceptions that Doser conducted for a number of years that was led by a sociologist called Elaine Eklund. Elaine is a Presbyterian. She was in church one day, and during the meet and greet, when you shake people's hands, in the course of the conversation with the woman in front of her, the woman said to Elaine, "Well, you know those scientists, they're all godless liberal atheists." And Elaine, being a social scientist, thought to herself, I wonder if that's true. So she decided to investigate it, and what she found was fascinating. She interviewed 1,700 natural and social scientists at R1 research universities across the US, and she found that 50% of us identify with a specific label. I am a blank. I am a Christian. I am a Hindu. I am a Muslim. I am a Buddhist. 70% of us consider ourselves to be spiritual people in that we think there is more to life than what our science can observe and quantify. And perhaps most fascinatingly, of the 30% who said they were atheist, 20% of those said they were spiritual atheists. If you'd like to know more, she has a great book, Science versus Religion. So the reality is we're a little bit more like this. Well, people might say, but why do you need that? We have the science, and we absolutely do. What the science does is it can tell us. It can tell us what is happening to our world. It can tell us the new records that are being broken, whether for global temperature, Greenland ice melt, hurricane intensification, heavy rainfall, or devastating heat waves. And it can document not only how climate is changing, but why. For the first time ever, humans are responsible. And we can go even further. We can quantify the implications of our choices. So we can say, if we choose to do this, here's what's going to happen. If we make this other choice, here's what's going to happen. Science can do this, but science cannot tell us the right decision to make. That is where what's in our heart comes into the equation, our values. And for those of us who fall into that 50% or 70% category, a lot of our values are informed by our faith. So this comes from an article that I wrote with 4 colleagues for the American Geophysical Union's blog. I'm Protestant, another colleague was Catholic, one was Muslim, one was Hindu. And we all agreed on this statement, although we came at it from completely different angles. My angle is that of a Christian, and we believe at this time of year that we are celebrating God's greatest gift to us. Every Sunday school child knows that God's greatest gift is his Son who came to give us spiritual life. But have you ever heard a sermon, a talk, a Sunday school class, a lecture on what God's second greatest gift might be? I never have. You could argue over it. I'm willing to go for third or even fourth. But somewhere near the top of that list, after God's Son, who we believe came to give us spiritual life, somewhere on that list, I believe, is our planet that gives us our physical life. There's a wide range of views on this home that we inhabit that range from worshiping it to treating it like garbage. But what most of us instinctively feel that we fall in the middle. We don't really fall at either extreme. And we understand that without the air that we breathe, without the water that we drink, without the food that we eat, without the safe places that we live that are provided by this planet, we would not be here. We are designed to live on this planet. It supplies the beauty of nature as well that feeds our souls, not just our bodies. And as Christians, we believe that the Bible says God made human beings in his image for a reason. That reason being to be responsible for every living thing that moves on the face of the earth. Rather than being given a piece of land and letting it decay and extracting every piece of value that we can from it, we believe that we are to be caretakers, to be gardeners, to be stewards, to have responsibility. And this is where the whole concept of creation care comes from. But this concept is still incomplete because we are living things too. And when we look at the impacts of a changing climate and who is most vulnerable to those impacts, we see that the people who are most vulnerable are the ones who have done the least to contribute to the problem. The people who are already hungry, the people who already do not have clean water to drink, the people who are already dying from diseases that nobody should be dying from in 2019. Climate change is, as the US military calls it, a threat multiplier. It's the hole in the bucket. It is not just an environmental issue. It is not just a science issue. Climate change is a health issue. It's an economic issue. It's a poverty issue, a hunger issue, a justice issue. It's an everything issue, and it connects directly to what we believe. As they say in Texas, where they print the Bible on road signs, that love thy neighbor thing, I meant it, signed God. But when you go to every other major religious tradition in the entire world, you see the same two themes of responsibility for our shared home and of caring for those who are less fortunate than us. So in that article that I wrote with my fellow scientists for the American Geophysical Union, Asma, who is Muslim, said, "As a scientist and a person of faith, I feel this obligation towards justice. The Quran states that we are guardians of the earth and uses the word compassionate for the attitudes that God has." My other colleague, Vaishali, is Hindu, and she says, "There's two concepts in my faith that appeal to my mind. The duty to care for and treat with respect all living things on earth, and the fact that our actions have an equal reaction in the future. We have a duty to do our part in ensuring that we have a functioning, abundant, and bountiful planet." I loved reading these because we didn't coordinate. We just went and wrote our own things and we brought them back together and we thought, oh my goodness, we use different words, but we're saying the same things. So why do we care? The reason we care about this is because of who we already are. Who are you? Are you a parent, a sister, a brother, a child? Are you a scientist, an advocate, a person of faith? Are you a hiker, a birder, a Rotarian? Who are you? Whoever you are, you're the perfect person to care. And the reason you care about climate change is because of who you are. So who I am then in turn informs not only why I care, but it informs what I think I should do about it. And that, again, is where our head meets our heart. So as a Christian, the verse that means the most to me about what we're supposed to do about it is this one. It comes from the book of Timothy, where the Apostle Paul is talking to Timothy, and he says, God has not given us a spirit of fear. When we hear people talk about climate change these days, fear is the overriding emotion. Fear that ending our use of fossil fuels will devastate the economy and ruin our lives. Fear that if we don't, it will devastate the economy and ruin our lives. Fear of this person getting control or that person doing that. Fear is what drives so much of our conversation today. But we're told, we're given a litmus test, that the spirit of fear is not how we're supposed to operate. We're supposed to operate with three amazing things. A spirit of power. What is power? Power is the ability to act, not be paralyzed by fear, but the ability to be empowered to act. How? Out of love and compassion for others, and, as a scientist, this is my favorite part, with a sound mind to make good decisions based on facts and data. So what gives me hope? Everything on this list gives me hope, but if I had to pick one, it's the thing that is nearest and dearest to my heart, and that is the fact that I am a person of faith. And my attitudes towards my child and other children, my attitudes towards my fellow advocates and organizations, technology, innovation, and education, all comes from that same foundation of being responsible and caring for others. So how do we spread this hope? How do we spread it is right there. It's the next thing on the list, by talking about it. When they asked me to do a TED Talk that was released a year ago this week, they said, what do you want to do it on? And I said, I want to do it on the most important thing we can do about climate change. And they said, well, we already have TED Talks on light bulbs. I said no. I want to do it about talking. How does talking give us hope? Not talking about all the depressing science, talking about why it matters to us in the places where we live and what we can do to fix it. Because when I asked you what gives us hope, what was the common denominator in your answer? People. How do we engage with people? By talking. By engaging with each other as human beings, by looking at each other eye to eye, by rejoicing in what we share, by respecting what we differ on, by talking together about how we could head into that better future, that is where we find our hope. And for me, hope is a bit of a reverse emotion. Because to end with one final verse that means a lot to me personally, again from the book of Romans, it says, hope comes from somewhere that we don't intuitively expect. Suffering begins with suffering. Suffering produces perseverance. Perseverance produces character. Character produces hope. And the hope does not disappoint, as other verses say. The hope does not disappoint because of why? Because of love. So no matter who we are, no matter what we believe, the only thing that counts is when our faith expresses itself through love. And I want to conclude with one story of a colleague who sought me out for lunch at a scientific meeting a few years ago. I wasn't working with him at the time. I knew him, but I was a little bit puzzled as to why he wanted to have lunch, and he didn't tell me why. So we sat down at the table together, and before I had even hardly sat down, he leaned across the table and he said, I'm a humanist, but I care too. And I said, well, of course you do. He said, I care about people. The reason I do climate science is because it affects people. And it disproportionately affects the poorest and most vulnerable people in the world, and that is not fair. And so that is why I do the work I do, and that is why I'm so concerned about climate solutions as well, because I care about people. And I said, yes, that's the reason we all care. And we all care because of who we are. Who we are does not have to be the same. Our differences are what make us strong. So whoever you are, whatever you believe in, the only thing that counts is when what you believe in expresses itself through love, and that is the path forward to hope, and that is the path to fixing this thing. Thank you. Now, one note here. Afterwards, we're going to have time for questions, and you can be entering your questions already. This is going to be open. You can type in your questions, no needs for dots or dashes or anything funny. Just type them all in, full question. And here's the fun part. You can upvote other people's questions. Yes. So we're going to have a great discussion afterwards, and we're going to be collecting these questions for the next little 20, 30 minutes. So go ahead on your phone. When you think of a question for myself or for Bishop Katharine, go ahead, type it in, and upvote somebody else's if you want to, and we will get to that. Thank you.
Did you want to leave up that slide that
It is.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Oh my goodness. Wow. Thank you. That was incredibly inspiring. Thank you, Dr. Hayhoe. We will have time for conversation between our speakers and all of you, but first we want to hear some reflections from our discussant. The Right Reverend Dr. Katharine Jefferts Schori, 26th Presiding Bishop of the Episcopal Church. Dr. Schori was elected Presiding Bishop of the Episcopal Church in June 2006, and until November 2015 served as Chief Pastor to the Episcopal Church's members in 17 nations, working to strengthen mission partnerships across the Anglican Communion and with other religious and civic partners. Bishop Jefferts Schori has been vocal about mission priorities, including the United Nations Development Goals, domestic poverty, climate change, and care for the earth, and international issues of peace and justice. Prior to her role as presiding bishop, Bishop Jefferts Schori served as Bishop of Nevada, and earlier was a university lecturer on fisheries, religious studies, and philosophy. Was that all one class? Or okay. A priest and hospice chaplain in Oregon. She began her career as an oceanographer. So you see, she's a scientist as well. She holds a BS in biology from Stanford University, an MS and PhD in oceanography from Oregon State University, and has been awarded several honorary doctorates. She served on President Obama's Council on Neighborhood and Faith-Based Partnerships and on the Division of Earth and Life Studies Board of the National Academy of Sciences. So we are very, very honored to welcome you here, Dr. Jefferts Schori, and we are very curious to know what you will share with us, your reflections on Dr. Hayhoe's talk, and also on all your experiences working with faith communities as a scientist yourself. So please welcome and come to the podium and share with us what your thoughts are tonight.
Thank you. It's a delight to be with you this evening for the 10th anniversary experience of the holiday lecture. I was asked to start by telling you something about where I come from. I spent the first part of my childhood near Puget Sound. I went to a girls' convent school where the Roman Catholic nuns in those years still wore long black habits, but on feast days they played hide and seek and kickball with us. They were also fierce disciplinarians, doling out numerical grades in diction, deportment, and penmanship, as well as French and mathematics. They taught us joy and hard work, and that each person has a particular vocation in life. Both of my parents were scientists, my father a physicist, and my mother eventually a virologist. They started taking us backpacking in the mountains around Puget Sound and exploring the sea as soon as we could walk. I was in 5th grade when we moved to New Jersey, and my dad went to work for Bell Labs. Culture shock and climate shock. We began to attend an Episcopal church where worship was in English, and the priest and members of the congregation became friends in that community. My school interests were in science and languages, and I was fascinated with the inventor of the aqualung and his work long before Cousteau's TV show became famous. The priest in that congregation told great stories about his time at Stanford, and I still yearned for the Pacific and went west for college. I was beginning to wrestle with the interplay of science and religion, but not until I went off to graduate school in oceanography did I begin to see a way into a dialogue and partnership. Reading early 20th century physicists like Bohr and Heisenberg and Einstein, all of them writing about mystery. The professor who took me on for my master's was leading multidisciplinary coastal research, as well as teaching a course on literature and the sea. When a childhood friend and pilot died in a plane crash, my grief sent me looking for community and support in the local Episcopal church. I found other scientists there, also wrestling with the science and religion dialogue. I learned oceanography as a systems science. Biology, chemistry, geology, and physics are particular ways or lenses that offer insight on the whole. Everything is connected, and you're going to miss something important if you try to exclude any of those lenses. My master's thesis examined the effects of dredging on estuarine faunal diversity. I shifted to cephalopods, that's squid and octopuses, for those of you who don't know. I shifted to cephalopods for my doctorate, looking at faunal relationships to different water masses, and later worked on acoustical assessment of squid fisheries. In the mid-'80s, a few of you in this room will remember that Reagan was pushing to build Star Wars, and the bottom fell out of the federal research budget. After a couple of postdocs, I couldn't find a job anywhere from DC to Hawaii. As I was wrestling with that reality, 3 people in that Episcopal congregation asked if I'd ever thought about being a priest. It took me 5 years to say yes. The journey has led me to understand both realms of inquiry as wisdom traditions, ways of knowing. Looking at the world with one of those lenses can yield important insights, but much greater depth perception is possible with both of them. Science and faith traditions are both community endeavors, and practitioners are held accountable by community members. Each tradition publishes its foundational and current understanding of truth. We call it scripture, written things, either as holy writ or refereed publications. Each continues to develop that understanding. Truth is honed through continued wrestling and evaluation of current teaching, as well as through revelation or paradigm shifts, and that development is evaluated in community. Change in either kind of tradition includes pain and challenge, for we are all creatures of habit. We like to think we're pretty clear about what is, yet none of us knows truth completely. Galileo reputedly opined that science teaches how the heavens go, and religion teaches us how to go to heaven. Like Katharine Hayhoe, I speak frequently about the need for both lenses. Most of us have visions of what the world could and should look like, and it's the religious impulse that generates passion to move toward the dreams of a healed and peace-filled world where justice reigns. Scientists have a passion for understanding how the world works and how it might work more creatively. Both kinds of passion seek more, something beyond the currently known. And both ways of knowing deal in hope for the realization of that more. Episcopalians have been shaped and changed in the last 40 years by a prayer that expresses that passion for what we call this fragile earth, our island home. More and more people are beginning to experience what's called solastalgia, the ache or suffering at the mess that we have made of things on this planet. That lament carries hope with it in naming the gap between what is and the vision of what might be. The truth tellers who name the pain and point to the gap are traditionally called prophets. 16-year-old Greta Thunberg is such a one, challenging us to repent of fouling our nest and the suffering inflicted on us all. To some, she may sound angry, rightly so. But in a world where truth now seems to be optional and readily denied, her lament both diagnoses the illness and prescribes treatment. The best of recent science tells us that we have around 10 years to turn the greenhouse gas curve around, and 2 decades afterward to decarbonize, if we're going to begin to restore the life-giving capacity of this planet. It is a daunting task, and yet it appears to be barely possible. We know that human frailty means that there are plenty of people who prefer to seek short-term profit rather than long-term health and flourishing for all. We've just seen that reality in the lack of results at COP25 in Madrid. The world's great religious traditions call that reality greed and selfishness, and continue to challenge people to seek the well-being of others in equal measure to their own. It's a transcendent vision and a holy goal. The kind of truth-telling and accountability available in healthy communities, both scientific and religious ones, is essential to reaching it. That word holy comes from the same root as whole, W-H-O-L-E, and healthy. A holy goal includes the recognition that healing's only possible in the context of the whole community. Indigenous spiritual traditions name this overtly. As the Lakota affirm, within the sacred hoop of existence, Changaleshka Waka, Mitakwe Oyasin, all are our relatives. The Abrahamic traditions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam proclaim a congruent reality, naming the Holy One as the source of all that is, land and sea, sun and moon, stars and sea stars, and every creature under heaven. We are all made of stardust and inspired, breathed into life. The Hebrew creation stories in Genesis make a lovely pun with the word ruach, a word that means wind, breath, and spirit. Those creation stories share truth about the relationship between human creatures and the other parts of our island home. Human beings, in Genesis named as Adam, earth creature, and Eve, living or breathing, those creatures are charged to have dominion over the rest of creation. The English word has its roots in domus, house, or domicile. Dominion proclaims collective responsibility for the life-giving aspects of this planet. In some sense, ensuring that every member of the household has enough to eat and to survive, if not thrive. This island home is not the private paradise of any one species or group. Earth has evolved as a womb of life, and it depends not only on biology to sustain that life, but other processes which are now being distorted and destroyed. I want to expand on your assertion that human beings are responsible for the other living creatures. We are equally meant to be guardians of what makes life possible here. We are called to love all of it as we love ourselves. For without those other parts, we are nothing and doomed to die. In truth, our ability to live here is the result of things like plate tectonics and orogeny, recycling the elemental stuff of this planet. We live here courtesy of adequate oxygen in the atmosphere and moderate levels of the other gases. Our fascination with various kinds of fire in the last few hundred years has disrupted the atmosphere's dynamic equilibrium. We've been enchanted by fire, and it's burning our fingers and those of glaciers and polar ice fields. We are remaking the planet in our own limited, idolatrous image, consuming the decomposed bodies of creatures that died long before our own, ironically named, species appeared. The burning is yielding death's finality rather than new life, except potentially in the renewed rising of prophets, truth tellers in scientific and religious circles, truth tellers to warn us of our grievous error and impending death. Solastalgia is the prophet's opening gambit, grief, lament, even ain't it awful. For truth-telling is always the necessary beginning of healing. We urgently need global repentance. And while that may sound like an overly religious term, it was originally allied with the word regret. Repentance means to turn around. The appropriate healing response is metanoia, a changed mind and heart, and a willingness to learn deeper truth. Our behavior doesn't change until our motivations change. And denial leads only to disease and death. Now, I imagine that most people in this room know something about 12-step programs like Alcoholics Anonymous. They're rooted in ancient spiritual disciplines. And the first one was developed by an alcoholic and an Episcopal priest. 12-step programs depend on accountability in community, and the groups are modeled on 18th century Methodist holy clubs. Small groups seeking the healing or wholeness of their members and of the larger community. I would submit to you that scientific communities utilize very similar processes and disciplines as fellow practitioners examine their results and then refine and publish their theories for the good of the discipline. And isn't that a fascinating word? Our shared global climate change challenge is rooted in consumption. Our ancestors met tuberculosis, and it's still a wasting disease. The Hebrew prophets talked about the disease of monarchy that exploited the labor of many for the benefit of the few. The prophet Amos called them cows of Bashan, who oppress the poor and crush the needy, all while lying on ivory couches and calling for more cocktails. Today's world suffers from the same disease. The consumption of the privileged few is laying waste to the lives and possibilities of the many, and to the processes that support the whole. Recovery from consumption or addiction is neither easy nor quick. It requires courage and stamina, sharing the truth we know, and remembering the ancient wisdom of all traditions, that we are intimately involved with one another and with all our relatives, including the inanimate processes that animate all living things. Recovery or healing can flourish only in community through honest conversation. Conversation doesn't mean just using words. Its English origins meant something much more like the intimacy born of shared experience. And indeed, there's a term in English criminal law called criminal conversation. It means adultery. But conversation like that the roots mean turning with. We might say something like hanging out together today. Scientific communities do it over the lunch table, in the pub, in other kinds of symposia, seeking theories that are ever closer to reality. Faith communities do it in spaces that treat people as uniquely creative, of equal worth, and in search of greater wholeness. Together, these communities of wisdom seek conversation across divides, not just at this social and political moment, but across time, considering those whom our indigenous siblings speak of as the 7 generations before us and the 7 generations yet to come. All are stakeholders in our current plight. And there is hope abundant to be had in each conversation across time and space. We need one another. Truth-telling in community is where we start. The search for truth is what gets most scientists up in the morning and keeps them in the lab at night. People of faith keep trying to turn their lives toward what is truly good. The decades-long work of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change tells truth about the illness of the planet and offers the outlines of a treatment plan. We all have a role in the healing, acknowledging our own part in the illness, making conscious decisions about how we participate in the Earth community, and embracing the hard conversations with neighbors near and far away, including governments and multinational entities. Advocacy is key, both in challenging the resistant to change their ways, if not their minds, and in supporting those most affected by climate change and with the fewest resources for adaptation and survival. We are all connected, and we are hearing voices of new generations among the boldest. There is hope in current examples of that kind of conversation. Can you imagine a conversation that might begin like this? My name is Katharine, and I'm in recovery mode. I consume too much. I'm trying to change that reality. I drive electric and charged with solar panels. I eat plants. I fly too much. I buy offsets. I recycle. I try to consume less. I vote for the life of the planet, and I try to advocate for the lost, the least, the left out, and the voiceless. And I try to keep an open and hopeful mind and heart. And I know that it is much easier to change when I have a community around me to support and solidify those changes. I want to encourage and embolden each one of you to the same kind of healing conversation and to stretch beyond your usual partners. Walk down the hall or across the street and ask others about their hopes and suffering. Pay attention to the intersectionalities in the climate crisis. The poorest are the most vulnerable. Women and children are almost always at the bottom of the food chain. Migrants have precious little access to social power. And indeed, most migration today has its roots in climate change. Working toward equal access to clean and healthy food, clean water, clean air, and clean energy for all will go a very long way toward reversing the current planetary crisis. Educating women and girls around the world is key, as is the willingness to acknowledge our responsibility to address the suffering. Transformation happens when communities embrace a new vision, both in science and in the affairs of humanity. Turn and face your neighbor and tell what changes you will make. Together, let's get back to a conversation in the kitchen and turn down the heat. Life depends on us. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Bishop Jefferts Schori. Those are heart-compelling words that you've given us, food for thought, and we thank you. We are now going to move to a time of conversation about what we've just heard. And so I would invite our speakers to come back up and sit here on the stage, and we'll have a conversation amongst ourselves and with the audience, and those of you who are sending in questions, we're receiving them. So please come on up. I want to, as you come on up, I'll keep talking here for a second, and if Dr. Hayhoe, if you could sit in the middle, and Dr. Jefferts Schori on the far side, and I'll sit here on the near side. This is very difficult because we are kind of informal here, and normally I would be calling them both Katharine by this point, but we have a Katharine issue here now because we have both of our speakers are named Katharine, and I would like to introduce to you our new Associate Director for the DOSER program, Dr. Katharine Hinman here. So we have multiple Katharines, and they are all spelling their name the same way, so it makes for a bit of an interesting evening today. So I'm going to sit down and join the conversation with our speakers. Let's see if this works. All right, does this work? Is this on? Do I have to do something to it?
Push the bottom of it.
Now? Yes.
How about
Mine's
this
on.
one? Does this work?
Yes.
Do I?
1, 2, 3. Okay.
Okay. The questions are going great. We've got over 40 questions that people entered online, and they've ranked them. And Jennifer is looking at those questions.
So we have these great questions, and thank you for sending them in. You can continue to send them in, and since I'm in the driver's seat here, okay, that's not working.
I'll get it going for you. There we go. 2 fingers up and down. It's a 2-finger mouse pad.
We want to start, well, first of all, thanks to both of you for your very compelling presentations. I want to talk first about, we have several questions here asking for stories of people that you've known in your lives or that you've interacted with who have changed their mind about climate change, perhaps people of faith, in faith communities. What is it that caused them to change their mind? Was it learning more facts? Was it hearing from someone they trusted? What was it that helped in your sphere of influence for someone, perhaps in the faith communities that you interact with, change their mind about either the reality of climate change or that they should do something about it? Dr. Hayhoe, Katharine H., do you want to start this? Okay.
So I have had many conversations with people who have changed their minds for ways that are different and also similar. So first of all, nobody today is a blank slate anymore when it comes to climate change. You have to be living under a rock to be a blank slate. So all of us have heard it's just a natural cycle. Those scientists are just making it up to line their pockets with those incredibly lucrative government grants that just fall into our hands like manna from heaven. It's going to ruin the economy to fix it, and it doesn't matter what the US does anyways because it's China who controls the world and the carbon emissions. So we've all heard these things. And so having answers to common objections, and actually what's even more effective is bringing them up yourself first. And that's what our Global Weirding series does. If you're familiar with that on PBS on YouTube, bring up the objection first and say, yeah, you might have heard it's cold outside, so where's global warming? But did you know? And then, you can explain the difference between climate and weather. What that does is that takes us from a -10 to a neutral. But it doesn't take us above that. It doesn't convince us, yeah, this is real, we need to do something about it. It just sort of disinfects from the misinformation. So what is it that takes us from a I couldn't care less to this really matters? It's something that is very simple. And that is recognizing that who we already are is a perfect person to care. We don't have to change who we are. In fact, caring about a changing climate and wanting to do something to fix it will make us an even more genuine and authentic version of who we already are. Whether we value the fact that we're a parent, whether we value the fact that we're a person of faith, whether we value the fact that we're somebody who's conservative, shouldn't we like to conserve? Whether we are a fiscal conservative, whether we are whatever it isn't a case of only showing that it's not incompatible with who we are, it's a case of showing that it makes us even more of who we are. So let me give you an example from a colleague who is here in the DC area now. John Cook is the mastermind behind a fantastic website called Skeptical Science. I don't know if you've heard of it, but it is the premier resource for answering every single but what about question you have ever heard about climate change. But what about Mars's ice caps? But what about the magnetic pole? But what about cosmic rays? It answers every question. Why did John start this website? Because of his dad. Every time he went home, for dinner, his dad would be like, well, John, there's more polar bears now than there used to be. How do you cope with that in your global warming? And did that website, did his son become the premier expert on debunking sciencey sounding myths on climate change, did that change his dad's mind? No. But a few years ago, there was a rebate on solar panels in the area where his dad lives in Australia. And if your identity is that of a fiscal conservative, you like to save money. The more money, the better. So his dad crunched the numbers, figured out how much money he could save, got the panels, saved a ton of money, went around telling everybody how, he was even more of a better fiscal conservative, saving all that money and, smart about it too. And then after about a year, he came to John, he said, well, John, that whole global warming thing might be real after all. But I'm doing my part. I have my solar panels. Did I tell you how much I saved last month? So what was it? It was identifying a solution that was consistent and compatible with his values that changed his mind. And so the basic concept underlies all of our conversations, but here's the beauty of the rich tapestry that is human life. That is the fact that all of us are different. So what is it that will change any given person's mind? It depends on who they are and what makes them tick. And that's why those interpersonal relationships, I loved your definition of conversation. It isn't just having words coming out of your mouth, it's having that intimate relationship with someone is necessary to really get to the root of what makes them tick and how you can not change who they are. It isn't about changing somebody, it's about helping them connect the dots between who they already are and why they would care.
Thank you very much. Do you have an example for us?
I do, and the bishops of the Episcopal Church meet together once a year, and they meet in different places. About 15 years ago, they met in Puerto Rico, where the diocese, there is a diocese of the Episcopal Church. And the Bishop of Bangladesh joined us for that meeting. And he told a powerful story about the experience of people on the plains of Bangladesh, coastal plains. And he said to us, my people are dying. You are causing this. You are causing the rise of sea level. You need to do something about that. That changed the hearts and minds of people in that room in ways that people in the United States weren't clearly aware of often. It was before, king tides in Florida were causing flooding routinely. Those bishops went back to their own dioceses and began to tell the story, I think, far more clearly to their parishioners. And it has, you talk to people in other parts of the world who are suffering the effects of climate change, and you see the devastation it causes. It affects people at the gut level rather than the intellectual level. And I think that's how change begins.
Yes, thank you. I'd like to ask if you could speak, you've both had very eloquent examples of individuals who've shared with you or have their perhaps minds and hearts changed, but are there examples of how scientists and faith communities are cooperating to do something collectively to address climate change, either the root causes of it or the impacts of it? Are there ways in which already scientists and faith communities collectively are working together, and or are there ways you could see these communities working together better in the future to address climate change?
Let me give, again, a very local example. In August, I spent a week on the Olympic Peninsula with young people from the Diocese of Olympia, Western Washington State, and people came with us, including a woman who works with NOAA, and we met several people involved in the Northwest Fisheries Center, and people involved in restoring the Elwha River. These high school students were learning about the effects of climate change up close and personal, with scientists to guide them through what was going on and what was happening. And they are the prophets of the current age.
I think there's so much potential to interact, and I would like to highlight something else that Elaine Eklund found in her study. She's a social scientist who studied all of us scientists and found that 50% of us identify with a specific religious label. She then, in conversations, went on to say, well, why do so many people think that science and faith are in conflict, and why do they not know about you? And what she found is that many scientists practice what she called a secret science. People in their congregation don't know what they do. We're afraid to bring it up because we're not sure what's going to happen if we mention that to somebody in our congregation. And so having I think the boldness to speak up can absolutely lead to conversations, and I have had them myself. But it can surprisingly lead to even better conversations than you can ever imagine, because people are curious and they are itching to know. And once they know they actually have somebody who shares their values, who shares many other things in common with them, they would love to ask you questions. And so a way that I've seen scientists engage very effectively, in a way that I've been trying to encourage colleagues to engage over the past few years, is many organizations are looking for scientists to help plug in with them. There's many organizations where people are very interested, they're very engaged, they're very active, but everybody instinctively understands the importance of basing what we say on sound science. And so there's tremendous opportunities for scientists to plug in with organizations across the spectrum. I myself serve as a science advisor for Young Evangelicals for Climate Action, for the World Evangelical Alliance. I point colleagues in other directions. I recently connected a colleague with the Catholic Climate Covenant. There are fantastic ways for us to connect our science to our faith. And I think that on an issue like climate change, where the ethical and moral dimensions are so clear, yet it requires sound science to move forward, that union is even more important.
Indeed. Well said. Thank you very much. Okay, so, continue to send in your questions, or vote up or vote down, because I'm looking down the list, and I wanted to avoid this one, but it is number 1. So here we go.
You got it up there.
It seems a very small number of people and corporations are spreading all the misinformation against climate change, but they seem very successful, as so many people believe what they say with no evidence. Why is this small number of people so successful, and shouldn't they be called out?
Yes. I think that's a piece of the prophet's task. I talked a lot about truth-telling. The boldness to tell the truth is really, really important. Everybody in this room has a different take on it, but complaining to those corporations changes their behavior.
I would say, and the person asking this question probably has, but if you have not read the book or seen the movie Merchants of Doubt, you should. Bookmark it right away. You've got your phones out, so go ahead, put it on your Amazon wish list, or however it is you save stuff, text it to yourself. Merchants of Doubt, you can either watch the movie or read the book, or both, because they're not quite exactly the same. And they specifically call out the corporations and the individuals who are deliberately muddying the waters. Another question I saw asked about, are you angry? And yes, I do get angry. And I think there are spiritual examples of anger. I think a lot about Jesus and the money changers in the temple. And I get angry not at people who don't know better, not at people who are looking for a reason or excuse to ignore this complicated problem they don't think they can do anything about it to fix. I get angry at the people who absolutely 100% know what they are doing and have decided for whatever reason that they would rather deceive people than tell them the truth. So yes, this is very effective, and I think part of the reason why it's effective, though, is because their message is falling into well-trodden pathways in the American psyche. Well-trodden pathways like what? Like, don't trust the government. That pathway goes back to the 1700s. Pathways like, oh, those scientists. That's a very well-trodden pathway too, right? Pathways like, oh, if it's a big problem, what am I supposed to do to fix it? It's our natural human defense mechanism. So their efforts, though they are extremely well-funded, and we scientists feel like the Boy Scouts and the Girl Scouts against the Marines often, the closest I ever came to quitting what I do is when I read a book called Climate Cover-Up by James Hogan. He is a PR expert, and he explained the PR techniques that they are using, some of which go back to the early 1900s. That's how long they've been developing smart PR techniques. And I read this book and I thought, what are we doing? I mean, I seriously felt like the Girl Scout with the cookies going up against the Navy SEALs. What is the point? I didn't even know there was a whole science and ammunition and weapons to this whole thing. But the reason it's so successful is because it is falling in those well-trodden pathways. And when we understand what it is that we want to be, that we want to believe, that's the beginning of the key to understanding how we ourselves can move forward and use our well-trodden pathways for good rather than evil.
Okay, here's a good one. They're all good. In your experience, what is it about religion that leads the faithful to reject science? And how can we as scientists communicate better to these communities?
I think there is a pervasive belief that religion is delivered as a fait accompli that doesn't grow and change and evolve. Faith in every tradition is meant to be, of the world's great religions, is meant to be a living faith. It changes, it develops, it grows, it expands its understanding. Science works the same way. If we teach people that you have to believe exactly how this is written, in which translation?
King James.
Yeah. We deprive people of their creative being made in the image of God. Religion is hyped and sold in the same way that corporations try to control markets. We have prophets who will call that out as well.
Thank you. Okay, and the second part of that question is how can we as scientists communicate better with religious communities? Maybe you have a thought on that.
So I have had a conversation that stuck in my head for years, and then just a couple months ago I had the identical conversation. And it was with a man, a scientist, who came up after I had given a talk about engaging with faith-based communities. And the man came up to me. The first time was in British Columbia. The second time was in California. And each time the man said to me, well, I've really felt like I should be reaching out to the religious communities in the area where I live. So I have been knocking on the doors of the churches, and I cannot get my foot in the door. What should I do? So I said, well, the best thing to do is to start with the people that you share the most with. So what is your own religious tradition? What is your own affiliation? What is your own denomination? And in each case, the man said to me, oh, none, I'm an atheist. So I said, stop. Stop, because you are not the person to be reaching that community. But let's talk about who you are. So, who are you? What do you enjoy doing? And he said, well, I'm a scientist. I said, yes, but what do you enjoy doing? He said, I'm a marine biologist. I said, okay. So what do you enjoy doing? And we went through a few things. No, I don't really enjoy hiking. I don't really enjoy birding. I'm not a member of the Rotary Club. I don't do this. Finally, the penny dropped, and he's like, oh, I'm a diver. I was like, yes, you're a diver. And then he started to warm up. He's like, yes, I've done incredibly deep dives. I've dived all over the world. I was like, you have seen firsthand what's happening in the ocean. You can speak to the devastation in the coral reefs. You can talk about the massive shifts in marine ecosystems. You could reach out to every PADI certification program in your area and ask them if they wanted to include something about climate change impacts in their training. Because you are a diver, and that is who you are, and that is the community that you can engage with. So in terms of reaching out to any community, no matter who it is, the key is, who are you? Did you grow up as a scout? Are you a member of the Rotary Club? Are you a parent? Are you a birder? Are you a lifelong DCer? Who are you, and who can you connect with that shares those values, and begin the conversation with what you share, connect the dots to why who you both are cares about a changing climate, and then bring in practical, beneficial, positive solutions that you can engage in to help move this thing forward.
Many young people have expressed a feeling of helplessness and grief in response to loss from climate inaction. Faith leaders are often providers of counsel for those grieving and struggling emotionally in their community. Are you aware of efforts to connect faith counselors and climate grievers?
Well, I'm reminded of what I think Gandhi said. Be the change you want to see. Become the change you want to see. I think empowering young people to respond, we certainly have some remarkable examples right now. not just Greta Thunberg, but 14-year-olds in North Carolina starting school strikes.
And there are a lot of people who are starting to engage on this issue. So two of my good friends, Anna Jane Joyner and Marianne Hitt, have an incredible podcast called No Place Like Home, where they engage a lot with the idea of climate grief and anxiety and our emotional response to this issue. Another colleague, Renee Lertzman, is a psychologist, and she just recorded a TED Talk, which I'm super excited to see, but it hasn't been released yet. But when it does, I'll put it on social media, so if you follow me, you can catch it. And as a psychologist, she talks about the anxiety that we struggle with. And repeat that word again that you used, the...
Solastalgia.
Solastalgia.
The pain at not being able to find solace or comfort in the environment that used to be home.
Yes. And we just finished a study that we submitted for publication, and I will not scoop it by telling you too many details, but what we found is that when students were exposed to a book and a lecture and a discussion group about climate impacts, without having tangible, positive, actionable solutions hand in hand, what happened to the majority of them was they just kind of fell right off the edge. They couldn't sustain the anxiety over long periods of time, and when we don't think there's anything we can ultimately do to fix it, we just dissociate. That's our defense mechanism. So that is why that, not Pollyanna hope, but that rational hope that's grounded on action, together in community with other humans, is such an important piece. It is our defense against this.
Thank you. All right, let me just tell us all, remind us where we are. We have about 9 minutes left of this conversation, and then I will be inviting you all to join us for a reception. But there are guards out there, so you can't go too soon. But we're going to have just time for maybe 2 or 3 more questions here.
Speed round.
I like this question. What are your favorite, speaking of, feeling like, well, what can I do? That kind of sense of, well, I'm convinced there's a huge problem, but I don't feel like there's anything I can do about it. It is kind of depressing. So here's a good question, which is, what are your favorite entry-level actions to suggest to those who may feel that climate change is beyond individual action?
Look at your diet. Look at your diet. Most Americans are robustly concerned about what they eat. Even reducing the amount of meat you eat a little bit is going to make a bigger change in the atmosphere than almost anything else.
And reducing food waste, too. We throw out well over 30% of the food we produce, in some cases as much as 40%. And so what I do is every year, I try to think up 1 or 2 new things to incorporate and to make a habit. I don't try to go, do everything at a time. And so last year, my thing was food waste and also getting my family hooked on Beyond Meat burgers, which they now love. But the food waste thing meant changing my habit. Instead of going grocery shopping once every 2 weeks, loading up, filling an extra freezer with food, I decided I was only going to go with 2 bags 2 or 3 times a week. And all of a sudden, the fridge is empty. There's no food. We eat everything. And I don't have an extra freezer. I put up drying racks instead so I don't dry my clothes. And I like just doing these little things. But I would say if there's one thing, kind of real entry level too, and a Meatless Monday is a great entry level thing, talking about it. Because when you survey the whole US, nobody talks about it. And if we don't talk about it, why would we care? And if we don't care, why would we act? And you might say, well, I'm not a climate scientist, or I'm not a faith leader. Well, thanks to the social science, we know that the #1 best messenger is you. Friends and family, #1 best messenger. And in fact, they've even shown that there's a true positive feedback loop, where the more you talk about it, the more your social network of friends and family starts to care about it. The more they care about it, the more they talk about it. That's a true positive feedback. And so having that conversation might seem like a simple thing. It might seem a bit like a scary thing too, right? But again, not hitting people upside the head with all the facts and data, but talking about why it matters to us, what we can do to fix it. And there's a lot of resources out there. There's the AAAS's resources of what we can do. There's fantastic examples and short videos with cool projects you can discuss. We have our Global Weirding series that talks about it. The National Climate Assessment talks about each region of the US and how we're affected. Find a few talking points and have a conversation.
Thank you. Someone wrote, I teach 4th and 5th grade Sunday school, and kids will ask me things like, if God is good, why is there global warming? How would you respond?
God is good. Human beings are made in the image of God. We can be better.
I would say it's free will. Yes, God did not create robots. He gave us the choice to act. And he gave us the ability to choose. And that is really what this is about. It's about our choices.
Thank you. And I would say that, to my knowledge, no one a century ago intended to start a global warming crisis by this revolution of new fossil fuel powering of the world. So it wasn't like this is something that we should necessarily feel some sense of guilt about for this crisis coming upon us. But now that we understand the science, it is compelled upon us to act on what we know and understand now. Would you agree? So, all right. I would like to ask you one more question and then give you time also to just make any closing remarks you would like to share. Is it important, and why, for policymakers and this larger scientific community and broader policy leaders in our country and others to engage with faith communities about addressing climate change, recognizing them as important players? Is that important, and why?
I would say it is because there's so many of us. I mean, well over 70% of Americans and over 80% of people around the world adhere to one or another faith tradition. And so if you think that you can move forward on this massive issue that affects every single person on the planet and every sector without engaging some of the core communities on which people's values are founded, it just doesn't make sense. But you would say the same thing about almost every sector. Can we move forward without engaging the business sector? I don't think so. Can we move forward without engaging the military? Probably not. Can we move forward without engaging the young people? No, they're already engaged. Actually, they're saying, come on, everybody else. To care about climate change, all we have to be is a human living on planet Earth, and that is why it is so important to show that whoever we are, whatever community we come from, we already care, we just don't know it.
I think it's essential for scientists and communities of faith to work together. The communities of faith I know are often curious, are interested, want to do the right thing, but don't always know how.
I would agree. And it's my understanding that faith communities around the world are often the ones right there with the communities that are experiencing the results of climate change already and have hearts to serve. And so the knowledge of science with the hands-on passion of faith communities can make a difference, I believe. All right, I would like to give each of you a moment to add anything else you would like our audience here or those watching from the overflow room or watching online to hear and before we close. Do you have any closing thoughts you would like to share?
The people in this room can change the world, and the people you know can help change the world. And I would challenge you to go and tell the truth you know and to be accountable in the communities you're part of.
One of my favorite scientists who I grew up watching as a young girl was Jane Goodall. I remember watching her movies when I was young, and since then, I thought, of course women are scientists. I mean, that's just the way the world is. But after a long career in science, and she's still going strong today, she said something which I think was profoundly insightful. And this is what she said. She said, it is only when our clever mind and our human heart work together that we achieve our full potential. So that is my encouragement to you as we move forward. We engage our clever minds, but we also connect them directly to our human hearts. Because only by expressing what we believe through love can we change the world. And that's what we're out to do. Thank you.
I would like to thank Dr. Katharine Hayhoe and Bishop Jefferts Schori for your outstanding remarks, your presence tonight in helping us think through these very important issues and conversations that need to continue beyond this evening together. Let's thank our speakers. Thank you very much.